Roy Hunt could not be with us today, so he left me the introduction to read. But I think that you all know that if Roy has created a course and selected speakers, that's all the accolades that someone might need. But we definitely miss him today and wish he was here. Our first session for the new urbanism in Alachua County is led by Dr. Cleary Larkin, an assistant professor and director of the Historic Preservation Program at the University of Florida. She is a licensed architect with over 25 years of specialized practice experience in historic preservation and community planning. She holds a professional degree in architecture from the University of Arkansas, a Master of Science in Historic Preservation from Columbia University, and a PhD with a concentration in urban planning from the University of Florida. Dr. Larkin has worked as an architect and a preservation planner at Fraser Associates in Staunton, Virginia, Beyer Blinder Bell in New York City, and for the city of Gainesville. Her practitioner experience includes adaptive reuse, restoration and rehabilitation, design and project management of architectural projects, from programming through construction, research and writing from historic structure reports, National Register nominations, rehabilitation tax credits, and design guidelines, design review in historic districts, new design within historic contexts, and the use of fiscal incentives for redevelopment.
I should have given you the short.
No, I'm equally impressed. Dr. Larkin moved to Gainesville in 2015 and served as the city's preservation planner from 2016 to 2018 while working on her dissertation about the development of the French Quarter Historic District in New Orleans. Her research interests include the intersections of architecture, preservation, and planning, both in historical and contemporary practice, and historic preservation as a justice practice that can balance equity, public health, and environmental sustainability and community resilience. She currently teaches Intro to History and Theory of Historic Preservation, Preservation Policy, and the annual summer field course at Preservation Institute, Nantucket. She is also a UF partner of Historic St. Augustine, Inc., with Professor Emeritus Roy Hunt. We are recording today, so if you please take a moment to silence your cell phones, and we'd like to introduce Dr. Cleary Larkin.
Good morning. Thank you, Julianne, and thank you to Roy for the invitation and arranging this lecture series. I'm really thrilled to kick this off for you with an introduction to new urbanism. Just a show of hands, how many of you have heard of new urbanism? Yeah, good. Okay. So we're going to start with some of the basics here. And actually, what I like to do at the beginning of my presentations, no matter what I'm talking about, is give you an outline. We're going to talk about what is new urbanism, a little bit of the history and background, some of the principles of new urbanism from the Congress of New Urbanism, which is the official organization that created this discipline and practice, if you will. And we're going to cover one of Florida's new urbanism projects called Seaside. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about critiques of new urbanism. But what I'd really like to start with is this question. I want you to think about, where did you grow up and what kind of place was it? Picture it in your mind. And I'd like to play Vanna White or Oprah Winfrey or something for a second. Who would like to tell me just briefly a little bit about where you grew up? What kind of place was it? Thank you.
It was a little farm town of less than 500 people in central Illinois, outside the state capital.
Great, thank you. So did you live in like a single family home on a farm?
We didn't live on a farm. It was a farming community surrounded by soybeans and cornfields. We lived in the town, didn't even have a street name, no stoplight. Wonderful.
It was wonderful. Okay, great, thank you.
I'm Robert Mounts, and I grew up here in Gainesville, son of a professor, and when the university only had about 11,000 students.
I got one. Okay. And what kind of house or neighborhood or place did you grow up in?
I regret my father was PhD and distinguished English professor, but never owned his own home. The home that they were renting when I was born was the church house right across from the O'Connell Center.
Love the church houses. Okay, one back here real quick.
I'm Paul Clayton, and like Robert, I grew up in Gainesville. The city limits ended where the, well, I guess it's where the soccer field is now on Newberry Road. I lived on the east side until I was 3 years old, and then we moved to Gulfview, which was absolutely the end of town, you know, where the old Gainesville Golf and Country Club, now the University course was. And
So a planned
I don't
neighborhood.
like the Gainesville new urbanism with all of these high rises built right up next to the road and all this retail space that they require
Mhm.
to be there that's empty.
Okay, thank you. And you?
Hi, I grew up in New York City suburb that was 20 miles from New York City with a commuter rail there. Mhm.
Was it a neighborhood and then you went to the commuter?
Built by a developer, right?
Thank you so much. So I grew up, I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I grew up in a suburb. My childhood was in a suburban neighborhood where I rode my bike and played with my friends in, you know, the woods around our neighborhood. And we had to drive to get to anything, a grocery store, a restaurant, to school. So these are all different kinds of places where we grew up. We have different experiences and memories. Now I want to ask you, think about the best place that you've lived. What did you like about it? And I'm going to ask for some different volunteers. It could be this place. Sir?
Good morning. I'm Richard Petway. I'm originally from Austin, Texas. And so I grew up around the University of Texas, Austin. And my grandfather was a chemistry professor and head of the graduate school. I have a PhD from the University of Texas at Austin. I'm on the faculty here at Gainesville.
What's the best place you ever lived and what did you like about it?
Boulder, Colorado.
And what did you like about it?
Well, I like to be able to see the mountains. And of course, I had National Science Grant to Boulder, and so I could look out at the Flatirons, which are historic preservation in Boulder. And then I could go up the road to Nederland, and be in the mountain community. It was just quite different than, even though Austin was hilly, it was not like Colorado.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Anybody else? Best place you've lived? Yes.
Corvallis, Oregon, college town, Oregon State, and on a river, very walkable. You can get outside of town very quickly to the country, and about 40,000 people when I lived there.
Great. So I'm hearing some connection to nature, some walkability. You want to look at something that's pleasing, makes you feel healthy and happy. I've lived in very small towns with like little Main Street communities. I've lived in a college town, Gainesville, Florida. I've also lived in New York City. So I've had a lot of different experiences of different places and types of living. And I think there's something that I like about each of those. New urbanism is a way to really think about how we get the best living for our neighborhoods and communities. So it is a planning and development approach based on the principles of how cities and towns had been built for the last several centuries. So these are organic. They just grew naturally. They had walkable blocks and streets, housing, shopping, and close proximity and accessible public spaces. They were human scale design because historically there weren't cars. You know, people got around by walking or with horses, carriages. So the idea of new urbanism is to really remove the dependence upon cars and get back to this historic way of living with walkability. So they're reflective of historical precedents and traditional design in two ways: architecture, architectural detailing in buildings, and urban form, thinking about a larger scale. We're going to look a little bit at the history, a brief history of urban development. Does anybody know what this is? Piazza Navona, Rome. This is the Noli map of Rome in 1748. Giambattista Noli created this. What's really interesting about this map, he did the whole city. It's a huge, beautiful drawing. What's really interesting about this is he showed the importance of public spaces. So typically on a map, you might have all of the homes sort of designated, and you see them individually, and then you might see the streets and a park and an urban space. Look at what he's done here. You see Piazza Navona, that is on your left, big public plaza, piazza. You see the Pantheon on the bottom right. You see churches in white. You see the roads and streets in white. All of the private spaces are shown in black. This is really emphasizing this Italian idea of community and the importance of urban spaces for public community. It's also really interesting because you look at the street pattern, it's very organic, right? It's not a grid, it's not Cartesian, it's not right angle. It just grew organically based on pathways, walkability, layers and layers of history, and what these were built on, what these buildings were built on. Anybody recognize this? This is the base of Manhattan. So Manhattan, European settlement by the Dutch, from the indigenous tribes that were there. You see in red, again, it's pretty organic at the base. What happened in 1811 is that they had what's called the Commissioner's Plan. And they were trying to decide how to develop the rest of Manhattan. The southern tip had been settled by the Dutch. The northern part of Manhattan, basically from like Washington Square Park, Greenwich Village, that area, was all undeveloped. It was little villages. It was natural wetlands, ponds. And the commissioners decided that the city was growing so much, they wanted to plan for the rest of the island of Manhattan. So what did they do? They made a grid. And so that's why the southern tip of Manhattan is very different than the northern part of Manhattan. There's also a really interesting sort of pattern of organic versus planned development here. Broadway is a diagonal road that runs up the island of Manhattan. And the commissioners made public spaces where these new gridded streets would intersect at Broadway. And then they also planned Central Park. So Broadway, being a diagonal street, was a traditional Indian path. And so that's very organic. But then what they did, and this is a new comprehensive transportation plan, they made these squares. So you can see the grid with 14th Street and Union Square at the left bottom. And at the upper right is the Central Park and Columbus Circle area at 59th Street. But then you have Madison Square at 23rd, Herald Square at 34th, Times Square at 42nd. So this is formal planning to make sure that development grows in a uniform way that they could predict. Anybody know this one? This is a diagram of the proposed Garden City model. This was in England by Ebenezer Howard in 1898. This was really a response to the Industrial Revolution that was happening in England at the time. And what he's done is he said there's a central city and it's got a limited population and it's got limited acreage. The limited population, 58,000. And then once you hit that, you have to start developing new hubs around it. And in between those are agriculture, reservoirs, waterfalls, homes for inebriates, insane asylum. Okay, so here we go with this idea of what the central city is and what's happening outside of it. This was taken even further. If you didn't know Ebenezer Howard, you're not going to know this one. This is Clarence Perry. He was a New Yorker. He created what's called the neighborhood unit in 1929. And the woman who grew up outside of New York City in a commuter neighborhood, commuter town, this is very similar to what Clarence Perry and his associates were developing at that time. New York City was very industrial, smelly, stinky. Zoning had just been developed in 1916 to separate industry from residential. There were also a lot of immigrants in the city. And, you know, at that time, there was a lot of concern about how do we house people. There were a lot of tenements, a lot of slums, a real concern about housing. So planners were really trying to think about how do we comprehensively plan neighborhoods? How do we use zoning to separate residential from industry? What ended up happening is that we used zoning to separate residential from commercial and industrial. And we even separated residential from itself, single family residential from multifamily residential, because there was no reason why we should have single family homes intersecting with the types of people who lived in multifamily homes. This was happening back in 1916, even in the 1920s, when legal discussions about the public good of zoning were happening. You know, the judge basically said it would be the same as having a pig in a parlor if you had multifamily homes and single family homes together. We're going to jump ahead a little bit. So we have post-World War II suburban development. Anybody know what this photo is? Levittown. All right. I'm glad you all know this one. It's an amazing photo. Long Island, 1947 to 1951. Really the first mass-produced suburban housing neighborhood. And for veterans returning from the war, the GI Bill, so it was affordable. It was really considered utopian. Now, I don't want you to think that there were no housing developments before this. There were certainly neighborhoods, but the key to this is this mass-produced, and they all look alike, right? And so we're starting to think about the efficiency of construction and how you solve this housing crisis of veterans coming back and needing a place for their families. I'm going to also say Levittown had restricted covenants. These were for whites only. Many of the housing developments had restrictive covenants. Some of them still have them on the books today. Along with Levittown and neighborhoods like that came the shopping centers. What's actually the thing that you notice the most in this photo? The cars. I mean, you know, this is really familiar to us. We know this in Gainesville. And so again, zoning and the separation of residential and commercial. You're going to get in your car, you're going to drive to the shopping center, get what you need. It was a lifestyle. It's an American lifestyle. Freedom. So again, going back to what is new urbanism, it is a response to what we just saw. So based on principles of historic and organic towns, but planned, right? Walkable blocks and streets, housing and shopping in close proximity and accessible public spaces, human scale design, remove the dependence upon cars, and look at historical precedents and traditional design in both architecture and urban form. The Congress of New Urbanism was founded in 1933. I've put this website in this slide for you in case you wanted to look it up. It's cnu.org. They have some really interesting information on their website. We're just going to go through some of the principles of new urbanism. They have a whole charter that's scalar and really talks in pretty formal and utopian language about what they want. That hasn't changed since 1999 when they published that. So it tells you a little bit that these ideals of new urbanism still hold true. So some of the principles they're looking at: walkability, pedestrian-friendly design, front porches and tree-lined streets. This gives us pedestrian scale. They have aimed for a 10-minute walking radius. Some of you might have heard right after the pandemic about the 15 or 20-minute city. So, thinking about walkability and what is the most practical amount of walking to do to get to a place such as shopping or a restaurant or a school or a business. Connectivity, an interconnected street grid network. It disperses traffic. It eases walking. You have narrow streets, boulevards, and alleys. Again, high quality pedestrian network so that you have a pleasurable experience in walking and in the public realm. If you look at this diagram, you see tree-lined streets. It's nice to walk along a tree-lined street. It's also nice to have storefronts and pedestrian scale, human scale architectural elements next to you as you're walking. Mixed use and diversity. The goals are to live, work, and shop within neighborhoods, within blocks, and within buildings. So you want to have a mix of shops, offices, apartments, and homes on the site, whether it's a block or a neighborhood. They also were aiming for a diversity of people, different ages, incomes, cultures, race. I think what's really interesting about this one is this hasn't necessarily worked out yet. And we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. But I want you to keep some of these things in mind for discussion at the end. Mixed housing. So a range of housing types, sizes, and cost in close proximity to each other. This is definitely not zoning from 1916 and not from the 1920s. This is a pig in a parlor. So this is townhomes, a common green, multiplexes, single family detached. And there's a lot of conversation about this today. A lot of places are looking at removing single family zoning because there is such an affordable housing crunch. We can talk more about that at the end too. Quality architecture and urban design. So again, hearkening back to those traditional architectural elements of historic cities to create a sense of place, an emphasis on beauty, aesthetics, and human comfort, special placement of civic uses and sites within a community. Think about that Noli map in Rome and the uses of the public squares and public spaces. And again, back with the human scale of architecture, you see a porch, you see trees. It's familiar architecture. When you get up to the neighborhood scale, you look at a traditional neighborhood structure. Often you have a public space at the center. You might have multiple public spaces. You have a range of use, densities here again within a 10-minute walk, and what they call transect planning. This is where you basically cut a section through your town and you have the highest densities at the center and it kind of dissolves into smaller scale and lower density at the end. And you want to create a mix of natural habitats and urban settings. So a lot of you mentioned, you know, the connection to nature, the view of nature, and some of the places that you had previously lived. Increased density. Does anybody know this photo? This is in Barcelona. So this is another planned development in Barcelona. Very historic, though, and looking at this urban density. I showed this because this is really an idea, this and New York City and other cities of the historic eras that just developed organically. You have buildings and residences and shops and services closer together. So you're having this efficient use of services and resources, and it's convenient. You can walk down the street. When I lived in New York City, I lived in a brownstone in Brooklyn, and I would often wake up in the morning and think, I don't have any half and half for my coffee. I have to walk downstairs and around the corner to the bodega to get it and then come back home. 5 minutes, which was great because I hadn't had my coffee yet. So, green transportation. Now, this is an interesting one because new urbanism really was formulated in the 90s and has been made to be ever evolving. And what are we thinking more and more about these days? Sustainability, green building, transportation-oriented development. We need transportation. We can't always walk everywhere as much as we might like to. We might like to bike, or we might like to have scooters, but let's face it, we're going to need transportation. So how can you make it green and sustainable? High quality mass transit that connects cities, towns, and neighborhoods while encouraging pedestrian friendly design and multiple types of transport, walking, cycling, scooters, etc. And here's sustainability: minimal environmental impact of development and operations, eco-friendly technologies, the value of natural systems, energy efficiency, and I think this one's really interesting, local production. When you think about that garden city diagram, we were all kind of laughing at the insane asylums and, you know, the people kind of banished from the city. But those were local agricultural places, you know, the ability to have a green belt around your town where you could have farms and produce the food for the people that lived there. Local production is going to be really important as we try to reduce carbon emissions and try to reduce the need for shipping for all of the goods and services that we use. And quality of life. This one, it's different for every person, but basically they've defined it as pride and a sense of place and healthier spaces that contribute to well-being. And the health benefits that they've looked at are, you know, showing really good outcomes and results. Higher usage of non-motorized and public transit modes means more physical activity. Lower usage of private cars means less air pollution. Safer streets, fewer traffic accidents. A complete community plan for all says better access to health resources. So this is getting really comprehensive when you start thinking about everything that you might need in a new urbanist community. I think what's really interesting is that this form of new urbanism in the 90s was taken up by HUD and was used to really reform public housing. So we think of public housing, we often think of what's called the projects, these sorts of dense towers in the cities with crime. And, you know, we think about, you see the demolition of these towers and what happens afterwards. And you can see on the left, you know, building communities and transforming lives, taking down the projects and building public housing in the form of new urbanism with porches and green spaces and walkability. New urbanism in the Sunshine State. There's a lot to talk about here, and I'm not going to talk about all of it, but I do want you to look at a couple of really well-known examples and feel free to look them up or, visit them. I'm sure some of you have visited these. The one I'm going to talk about is from 1980. So pre the Congress of New Urbanism, that Seaside in the Panhandle. Has anybody been there? Yeah, some of you have. What about Celebration at Disney? Okay. Panhandle, here's new developments, newish in the 90s. I remember the Panhandle when it was like concrete block motels. From Memphis, we used to drive down and that's where we would stay. So Rosemary Beach and Alice Beach, have y'all been there? 30A? Okay, they're newer developments that are really closer to Panama City, just west of there. And then West Palm Beach has City Place, Winter Park has Park Avenue, and Orlando has Baldwin Park. These are just a few. If you look at the State Congress of New Urbanism, there are a lot of new urbanist developments here. I want to take a few minutes and show you a video. It's 15 minutes, so feel free to stand up, stretch, move around, walk, be comfortable. This is from Andre Stwaney, who, with his wife, Elizabeth Plater-Zybeck, were the architects for Seaside. And I think what's so interesting is this is 1980. You think about what Florida was and then what it developed into 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Who's local Floridian in here, born and raised? So you all know. I've heard stories, but this Seaside development was really ahead of its time. And I want you to hear from the architects what their intents were. And then we're gonna think about it 40 years later and think about what it is now, okay? So again, feel free to stand up, move around if you need to.
We went through a very strange time in America over the course of basically the 50 to 60 years post-World War II, when everything we knew about how to build a community was more or less thrown out the window. And it's an era that I grew up in. I grew up in the sprawl that resulted from it. And the folks behind Seaside were some of the people who really finally said it loudly and said, this is going wrong. We need to do something differently. Seaside is an 80-acre resort community located on the Gulf of Mexico in Northwest Florida. It was founded in 1981 by Robert and Daryl Davis, Andreas Dwani, and Elizabeth Plater-Zybeck. Robert and Daryl and Andreas and Liz said, we're going to create an actual town. And that was where they really, really went just a completely different direction and a new way that really shook the earth a bit and has spawned community after community, in fact, an entire movement called the New Urbanism, which is a movement to move away from sprawl and towards mixed-use, walkable communities.
Well, you know, it's the summer of 2010, and it's almost exactly 30 years ago that we were designing Seaside right here on this piece of ground. This land had been logged and possibly burnt. There was a kind of bramble about 3 feet high everywhere, exceedingly ugly. And we had been retained by Robert Davis, a developer who at the time was about 35 years old. And when we met him, the one thing that was absolutely clear in his mind is that he was allergic to debt. Whatever was going to be done here, it was going to be done on the basis of avoiding substantial debt. And every step of the way as Seaside was designed, the technology, the ideas that were eventually implemented had to do because they cost less. And I think that's, in retrospect, that's the huge story. Do you see this so-called amphitheater? This amphitheater is actually the retention pond for all of Seaside. So it has a double use. You know, in conventional development, you do a retention pond, you know, for the 1,000-year storm event. You put in chain link fence. It's a maintenance problem. Looks like hell. Waste space. Here, the avenues all come in like that. It can all sheet flow on the surface to this. And if there is a 1,000-year storm, it actually goes here. But in the meantime, it's actually used by little kids. This and the school playing field, oh, and just in front of the church for the wedding photographs, these are the only places where there's lawn. Lawn is illegal elsewhere because it requires maintenance and it requires water. Everything else is whatever grows. Basically, all of this is, these are all temporary buildings. They're for incubator retail. People get a chance to start their shops in very inexpensive places. If they do well, they get decanted to the 4-story mixed-use buildings where the rent is serious. And if they fail, they fail. But there's no air conditioning. You know, there's no installation. There are no footings, no inspections. Why? It's temporary. Leave us alone. So it's the way to start things. And if you look at the early photographs of any place, from New York to Berkeley, this is pretty much how the merchants began. Very simple, temporary buildings that later on became Nordstrom's and Macy's and, you know, the big merchants. I think I remember that this building, which again is temporary and just sitting on the ground, sitting on sleds on the ground, is where the bookstore was incubated, Sundog Books, which is a terrific operation. And, you know, bookstores don't necessarily survive. So they proved themselves here, and then they went and, once they could actually pay a real lease, they moved over, and they're now over there in the 2-story building using both stories and becoming a real business, you know, and employing, you know, half a dozen or more people. And that's one of the great stories. And incidentally, for every successful store, there's been 1 or 2 failures. I mean, it's work. It isn't just saying, follow these rules and you'll end up like Seaside. It's work to do it. These shops are where the places finally go. Pizzitz, which is a nice little department store, is the direct outgrowth of the original tables, Daryl Davis's original open-air tables. That's where she decanted her operation. Okay, look, these are the new incubators. The newest of the incubators are the Airstreams. That's a mixed-use building, shops, offices, and 2 stories of apartments. You know, that's a mixed-use building, which is, by the way, very nice, but that's a very expensive way to build. All the 4-story buildings are expensive, no way around it. And if you're going to wait till you have the money to build them, you won't. You have to build the single story and then higher. And by the way, our other projects here on the coast are always that way. We always begin with single story, and then they move on to higher later. Now, these are the live-work units, okay, which are not the same as mixed use. Mixed use is, you know, they're different people. It's not the same people that own the apartments don't own the stores. These are owned as single entities. Like, that's an apartment, I mean, that's a dwelling, and that's a shop. That's a dwelling, and that's a shop. There are 22 of them, and they sold immediately. And every time we design a community, the developers fight us in the live-work units. And then they come back and say, oh, they sold the best and for the highest price. And the reason is that there's you know, everybody thinks, developers think that the only American dream is the little house in the prairie, you know, which is has been reduced to the single-family lot in the cul-de-sac. But there's another dream, which is being your own boss. A lot of people came to America to be their own boss, And the live work unit allows you to dream of being your own boss. In fact, often to implement. You know, the little store you always wanted to run, the really cafe, the restaurant, you can do it. The good thing for the master developer is that a lot of retail gets built without risk to the developer. That's on somebody else's, it's on somebody else's checkbook and on somebody else's watch to do it. But all these are live work units. The new urbanism is, despite what people think, is agnostic to style. Okay, we're not style conscious. Like, for example, if you look at that, you see two postmodernist houses and a completely modernist one over there. Or actually, even more telling, over here, you see a whole row of relatively traditional townhouses and then a totally modernist one. Okay, we don't code, and this is all, they didn't get variances. That's how the code works here. So this is the chapel. All we did was reserve the site for a chapel. The citizens themselves raised the money to do it, which is actually the old way of doing things. This is a good shot. Here are 3 towers. People think, oh, they're so romantic. Oh, isn't it nice, towers? Those are not aesthetic. That gives every house a chance of a water view. And it's one of the ways that you increase value of the real estate deep, deep into the, into the hinterland, which had no value. So there's several techniques you use. The first one is you have the streets all end on the beach. No ambiguity. And then you have a pavilion that signals to the whole depth visually. That pavilion at the end of every street says, here's access to the beach and it's yours. You can actually see it. Aha, there's the beach. But the third way is that every house is allowed to have a tower of limited footprint so that they don't block each other's view. And the view from up there is really beautiful. And that's one of the reasons that people have paid well above waterfront prices to live at a quarter mile from the waterfront. You know, one of the things when you make really narrow roads is the pedestrian becomes absolutely dominant. Here, 5-year-old children, because the speed is so low, 5-year-old children, it's perfectly safe. So what it's done is really liberate the kids. That's actually it. They all have to move very slowly. Well, that was the first house. That's where Robert lived. You can see that it has overhangs and it has the metal roof that actually reflects the sunlight, which, by the way, is now very common. At that time, it was never used in any respectable house. In fact, we got into trouble by having such low-end materials as zinc roof, which is now absolutely conventional. So the overhangs, the porch, the ventilation at the top, but also the native species. And I remember my brother Douglas crawling, actually, and looking at these things that were really very low and ugly, and picking up samples and saying, look, this is really excellent. This is what it is. We have to keep it. So most of what you see in a place like that actually is underbrush that looked awful, and everybody else just bushwhacks, gets rid of. And by building the houses, blocking the wind, the sea wind, they've grown and become oaks. And there's no maintenance required. And all of this was due to it being less expensive. Now, the brick is another example. Of course, the brick per square foot is more expensive than asphalt, but you can order it up in very small increments because it's hand installed. The asphalt guys, they don't get out of bed, for less than a quarter mile or half a mile of pavement. So while it costs less, it costs more to put it in and have to carry it for years. Well, these guys, I remember they would come in and they would just do 3 lots at a time. And another thing is, because we tried to save money, the roads were narrow, which means we didn't pay very much. And then this actually remained to filter the water down. So originally, I mean, there was actually no notion of pervious surface in those days. Nothing. It was all about putting it in the pipe. You know, you take the stormwater, you put it in the pipe. Of course, that was too expensive. So we did this, which proved to be absolutely sound environmentally, but not for that reason. We did this because it was less expensive. And I think one of the things that's going to happen that's tragic about the current environmental practice is that everything costs more. You know, the high-tech solution to everything, the high-tech pervious surface, the high-tech LEED standards for housing, all that stuff basically works against the success of environmentalism because it costs 30% more. And there's no reason for that. If you do it the original way, you know, the original green, it costs less. And not only is it less expensive, it's actually the more logical way to do it. It's more handcrafted. Anyway, so inadvertently, Seaside, and not because we had this in mind, but inadvertently, this has become an excellent model. And this might, in the end, be the most important of all the ways that you can interpret Seaside, is the what it shows in terms of an environmental solution that is actually simple, affordable, and doesn't require a great deal of training or skill.
So I think one of the things that I'm always really attracted to when I think about old Florida, or the reason why I'm a historic preservationist and an architect and a planner, is because the way that makes sense to build is to think about place-based design. Where are you? What are the native and local materials, building traditions, plants? How do you design a building to respond to the environment? Those designs also give you an idea of where you are, right? A lot of what we see today and kind of this quick build, throw it up, you know, it all looks the same, it's placeless. So one of the interesting things about Seaside is that they took, you know, a pretty historic, what we call vernacular building, and looked at that and thought about what are the things that make it work for its site and its condition, and modeled that in some of the houses that you see. The commercial buildings are totally different. The towers that you see for the beach pavilions, all architect designed, individual architects designed all of those. So they are placemakers. So it's a real mix of local vernacular design, contemporary design for commercial buildings, star architecture design for these pavilions as placemakers. There's some pros and cons to Seaside, and I think they're reflective of a lot of new urbanism in general. So I'd love to hear from you all some thoughts too. I'm going to start here and then we'll work our way around.
I knew there was an advantage to being in front. Yeah, I think in terms of pros, I'm a real believer in this. I think that there are a couple of things that are underestimated actually in the video that could be bragged about in the video. One is that a lot of people like low maintenance, and not so much for the community, but for individuals. As individuals get older, having maintenance-free residences is very important. The other thing is that new urbanism really emphasizes congregate living and community living in a practical way, not just a political way. I think that's very important. One of the downsides I can see, however, is you don't see any poor people here because it's very expensive to live here. So the idea of economic sustainability is very important.
Thank you. That's a really great point. All of those are great points. And I want to speak to the last one. I think we have an affordable housing problem everywhere, in every city, in every town. And some of these places, like Seaside, have become resort towns, have become a place where you own a second home and you short-term rental it. That's another contributing challenge for affordable housing. So developing with these ideals, but then 40 years later, maybe perhaps compounding the problem. Okay.
What I didn't, the goals of new urbanism are definitely very laudable. And Seaside is like a model city if you can do it from the ground up. What I didn't see there is any Black people, any poor people. And what I didn't see there was 77,000 students competing for housing against neighborhoods like we have in Gainesville. And when you talk about multifamily housing in Gainesville, they're primarily talking about big box student housing, which is multi-resident, multi-transient, all competing to rent by the room, which is the profit incentive for big developers that come to Gainesville. And we've seen the results of that. And that's why my former neighborhood at University Park, and I and Kim Tanzer and others, that we've combined with the African-American leaders in Pleasant Street, Fifth Avenue, Porter's Quarters, to fight some of these ideas that are citywide solution, to make it more dense. And there's still another one coming down the pike from Commissioner Eastman. So what I've pointed out for years is that Gainesville is unique, and we already have these patterns. And believe it or not, our African-American friends just want to maintain their neighborhoods, their culture, their community center, their churches. They don't want to be displaced. They don't want to be gentrified. And that's why they've allied with some of the richer Northwest neighborhoods who are trying to protect their homes from the incursion of students.
Thank you. I think something that's really relevant in thinking about this is this idea of, organic development versus planned development. And, a lot of these neighborhoods that were developed in the 20s, 30s, 40s with the university, it was a different time back then, right? And so the planning of neighborhoods was different. And this idea of let's make a midtown, let's have a commercial density, let's have mixed use with residential on top and storefronts on bottom. It's all very well intentioned, and it worked in a time when you didn't have suburban shopping centers. So now you have competing uses and you have competition for mixed use in downtown. And then you have Archer Road and Newberry Road. And so I think we're in a different time here. The diversity question that you raised, Bob, is a really good one, and that you pointed out as well, ma'am. The affordable housing, the affordability of these, the location of these places. There's not really a grocery store at Seaside. There's a gourmet market, and then you drive down 30A to get to the Publix. Where's the work? Where is the daily needs? Where's, shoe repair, a post office? We have a bookstore and a gallery and a coffee shop because those are things that tourists would like to see. What's the usability and livability of this place and others? Yes, sir.
I think new urbanism works better when it's started from the ground up rather than trying to force new urbanism in established cities. Gainesville is a good example of forced new urbanism. They have all these high rises. You still have to travel somewhat to get to work, but the denser it is, the more problem on the roads. Gainesville really has a very lousy road system as far as getting from one side of town to the other. you know, I-75 should not be a transportation for Gainesville, but it is. 39th is another one. We sort of have a circular route. If you go 39th, I-75, Williston Road, and Waldo Road. I mean, that's kind of a circle road.
At
So
least
those
it's
get a
not an
lot of the
interstate.
traffic, and as the traffic gets worse, people find other shortcuts, which sometimes go through neighborhoods. It's not a good thing. The bus system is horrible unless you're a University of Florida student. I looked one time when they were saying, you know, bus, bike, or walk to work. I figured out it would take me 2 changes and 3 hours transportation to get from my house to North Florida Hospital.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, so I think one of the interesting points that you raise here is I think you said forced new urbanism. And as new urbanism has evolved over the past 40 years, there have been more and more ideas of getting back to this historic urbanism. Can we bring to life historic main streets and neighborhoods? What can we do for downtown Gainesville? I think, you know, the idea that we have existing buildings and neighborhoods that need to be used and are fairly walkable. You still have to get to downtown, but once you're there, you can walk around. So this idea of bringing those places back to life. I think you had a comment?
I don't know. I don't know where this fits in new urbanism, but I noticed personally just last week that I feel like everything wants to come to my home. And that increases isolation. My insurance company is offering, you know, for a nurse to come to my house. Amazon wants to deliver to my house. They want to deliver the food to my house. I see this increasing trend that I don't think sociologically or psychologically is a good trend. It works against that kind of environment.
That's such a great point. And I think convenience, but then also, you know, the impacts of the pandemic really made that kind of a permanent, marketable, you know, income producing. You never have to leave your house. I mean, who here has ever lived in a neighborhood with a porch and never used the porch to talk to your neighbors? You know, it's we develop these houses with porches and neighborhoods. Nobody's on them, nobody's talking to each other, speaking very generally, but it's a really good point that our services, the internet, there's a lot out there that has kind of changed our social value. And new urbanism, ironically, was all about bringing that urban gathering. So it's a great point.
Dr. Larkin, there was a question on chat that said, has anyone visited Seaside recently? How is it doing?
Has anyone? I will say I went there maybe 2 years ago. And I think there, to me, a lot of the development along 30A, Seaside, Rosemary Beach, Alice Beach, it's all vacation spots. And I remember when I was an architecture student in the 90s going to Seaside to see the architecture. And there may have, I'd be really curious to know what is the percentage of homeowners that actually live in those houses year round? And what is the percentage of housing that is now investment owned properties for short-term rentals and vacation rentals? So I'm not going to lie, I have used short-term rentals. I do that often to go to the beach because I can't afford a beach house, but it is causing compounded problems with housing, with this living in a place, knowing your neighbors. And it's happening everywhere. I mean, it's happening all over the United States.
I wanted to go back to the front porch idea. I remember some time ago seeing information about someplace in Austin, Texas, I think it was, where a community was developed with front porches. an emphasis of walkability and the ability to establish and reinforce the community because you saw people and you could find out who they were, as opposed to driving into a garage with a garage door opener. It opens and then it closes, and then the whole house is sealed off from the rest of the community. So I thought that was an interesting point, that front porches was something that was viewed as being important.
Right. And in order to make a front porch usable, your house has to be close enough to the one next to it. So some of these, suburban developments, while they may have started out as fairly small lots and small houses, right? Starter houses. We don't have starter houses anymore. And so the neighborhoods grew and the lots got bigger and the houses got bigger. And now you see really large houses on, large lots, or you see these large lots that have been subdivided and then, with denser housing on it. But it's true, the porch has to have a context to be usable. I saw an article the other day, I believe it was in Los Angeles. There's a project to help with homelessness, and it is a development of tiny houses. There's probably like 60 tiny houses in this development, and it's single family occupancy. But do you know what they look like? They look like little houses with a porch, and there's 60 of them all together. And this development provides for healthcare, career services. It's temporary housing to try to get you into a home, get you healthy, get you on a health regimen, help you find a job, kind of like these incubator businesses that Andres Dwani was talking about, but they all have porches.
Peg Owens. Having been a pioneer in celebration, and I can see the wisdom now of Disney not allowing short-term rentals. In the beginning, you could not even sell within a year, I think it was. And now, in your contracts have always been 6 months is the least you can rent. So I can see why they didn't want to sell it. They didn't want something, like on the Panhandle. Yeah.
That's a great point. I didn't realize that. I didn't know that about celebration, but it really is, when you think, I'm going to just kind of go out a little bit and talk about gentrification and displacement. Why is it so important? Because it's getting rid of long-term owners in neighborhoods, right? And short-term rentals are doing the same thing. And so this idea that you want to encourage people to buy a place and to live there for at least a certain amount of time. It's not just an investment, it's a place that you're investing in personally as well. So that's a really interesting idea. It's a good business model, right? But it's also encouraging placemaking. Yeah.
Can you repeat that?
Oh,
Just for Zoom, the people didn't hear.
I was just going to say the Airbnbs were the scourge of University Park neighborhood.
they are the scourge of a lot of neighborhoods, I think. Yeah. Other thoughts? Yes.
How has Seaside fared during the hurricane seasons?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that, but I will look it up, and at the next lecture, I'll try to let you know. I think the last major hurricane over there hit in the Mexico Beach and Panama City area, and then further west in Pensacola. So that area in between where Destin is and all of that, I'm not sure has gotten a direct strike, but I don't know. I do know that they have, the dunes as well, that protect the development, and the retention pond. What did y'all think of the retention pond?
Yeah.
Good idea, right? I cannot stand driving around Gainesville and seeing all these chain link fence with private property Florida DOT. Can we make it usable? Yes.
You were talking about front porches. I can remember visiting my grandparents like in the 60s, and I had one grandfather who would like maybe 2:30, 3 o'clock in the afternoon go sit on his front porch, and they lived like, I think there was maybe a block and a half between their house and the beginning of that small communities downtown, and they lived on a relatively long block, so that block was walkable to the downtown area. And he used to talk to everybody who walked by, and there would be, people across the street. It was kind of a wide street, but they, would wave at each other and shout at each other, how you doing, what's new, kind of across the street. And that environment doesn't exist anymore.
It's interesting. When I lived in New York City, I lived on a street in Brooklyn that was brownstones with stoops. And it was a very diverse group of people that lived there. We had people like me in my 20s, working in the city. You had people that were retired and had bought there in the 60s and 70s when it was, not a great place to live by any means. And they would sit out on their stoops. And every day I'd get out of the subway and I'd walk home, and I knew them all by name because they were on their stoops. They wanted to talk. They wanted to say hello. And it's the importance of that interconnectivity between generations too. You want to have communication between the generations. And so the stoop in Brooklyn was like our southern porch. And so it takes different forms. It's like the piazza in Italy. It takes different forms. But I think that sort of communication and community is one of the goals of new urbanism, that I don't think we want to forget about. And over the next few lectures, we'll talk a little bit about kind of these historic urbanism and new urbanism, and then Hill Plantation as an example of new urbanism that was developed here in Gainesville.
Dr. Larkin, I know when Roy had the brainchild for this whole course, he said you must be involved, and we really appreciate all your contributions today. And on behalf of Roy and all of us, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you all for your participation. It's really great to hear everybody's perspectives on something as important as this. It's great to see you all.